Hello and welcome to the podcast. I'm here as always with John Mixon. John, how are you?
Good, Dan. And you're back from some travels. We had that Saudi Arabia roundtable, and you just went back since then, right?
Yeah, I got back last night. I was in Saudi Arabia and then I was in Bahrain and then I was in Dubai in the UAE as well. So a bit of a round
Great.
trip over 8 days.
Yeah, and you were working with a lot of international schools, and I think it's kind of interesting how, that whole area is growing so much, and so many new international schools are coming online. We were talking, I think, what was it, 700, did you say? Or
Potentially, yeah. I mean, this with the city of Neom, which is being built, the line, we talked about this like
yeah,
200 kilometer, it's two walls of a city in between. It's kind of crazy. They're building a new city. So, and Riyadh, they're doubling the size of Riyadh. So, what was interesting was there was I don't know if you've heard of the LEAP conference. It's actually the biggest technology conference in the world. It was on in Saudi when I was there. And it was just crazy how like you could see the infrastructure wasn't there to deal with it. The hotel prices were insanely expensive. You couldn't get Uber, you couldn't get around. There's no public transport, and it was just like it was really kind of quaking at the seams. So
kind of.
interesting. It was great fun. Great to be there, to see the growth and everything.
Yeah, and sometimes with that growth, there's those pain points,
Yeah.
not being able to keep up. Well, today it's, the summer is coming up, and we have the topic of online and blended learning. And I think all of us, and Dan, you and I talked a lot during COVID, and also you did a lot of online. You had to actually do all your face-to-face switch to online, and there were a lot of challenges with that, but schools had to do that too. And all schools kind of rose to the occasion at different levels and different ways in different contexts. But one thing that we thought would be interesting is now that 18 months or however long it is, it's been 2 years, 3 years since COVID, we thought, what a better topic to talk about online blended learning, because where are we today? Are we doing it differently? Are people engaging? What are the lessons learned? And I think I have very likely the best three guests in the world to talk about this. First is Michael Neshbar, who's the Executive Director of Global Line Online Academy. Welcome, Michael, and thank you for being on the podcast. And then we have Kathleen Ralph, who's the Blended Online Coordinator at the Frankfurt International School and also involved with the Global Online Academy. And Eric Hudson, who actually made the contact, and I've known a bit virtually, is an independent consultant, but was the Chief Operation Officer of Global Online Academy and the Director of Teaching and Learning. So a warm welcome to all three of you today.
Thank you.
Good to be here.
Thanks for having us.
So the first question is I'm going to ask Michael, and then we can kind of talk about this. Michael, adapting to post-pandemic education, can you share from your own respective work as an organization and the experiences, why some international schools have successfully adapted to changes in the educational landscape, with online and blended learning post-pandemic, while others maybe have struggled, even though they had the experience of online blended learning?
Sure. There's so many layers to that question. Thinking about why some schools struggled in that landscape, I think is required. I think there were some schools that, and we all know this now, right? They would just try to move things online without rethinking them. And that posed challenges for the way that students wanted to learn and the way that this environment lends itself to supporting students with flexibility, rethinking time and place. So that transfer, I think, was a challenge. I think the schools that have been successful have been and continue to be the ones who are using this and you did use this online space as an opportunity to rethink things, right? To rethink systems, to rethink the ways that they wanted to engage students. And I think now too, they're being responsive to what students need and are looking for. Like, we know that there's a lot of these kids now are looking for more flexibility in how, when, and where they learn. And a lot of schools are providing that through online classes. I think there is an issue in schools currently with faculty hiring and retention. I think engaging in online spaces provides more flexibility even for adults. Yeah, I mean, there's again, right? Like we think about these kids who were online during COVID. They were in the 6th grade, 5th, 6th, 7th grade. Online learning wasn't that bad for them. They got to sleep in and lead a healthier lifestyle. They got to snack during the day. That might have just been me. Their teachers were super creative in most cases, right? I mean, they were working harder than ever. And so when they think back on their online learning experience, it wasn't all that bad. The adult, on the other hand, had a different experience. So thinking about the ways that schools are engaging them and what teachers are looking for is different.
That's really interesting that you bring up that point of the student's perspective, that, you know, they kind of look at that very positively. And then the facilitators, the people that are creating the lessons, had those challenges that you brought up. Kathleen, you wanted to add to that.
Yeah, and I think I would say that not all of my students had a positive experience, especially not so much the ones that were FIS, but the kids that came from other schools and are here with us now. Like, we recently had a snow day where we went online, and there were kids like the next day, they were like, that was so triggering, you know? And I just really think it came down to like well-resourced schools and schools that were prepared to go online and had those kind of resources available, where kids were already using some of these tools rather than learning them for the first time. I think well-resourced homes, if homes had good access to Wi-Fi, it was a great experience. If they didn't, it was bad. As far as like parent population, were they working from home and trying to suck the same bandwidth? We had some parents that like they chose to go to a totally different location because where they were living, they couldn't do work and have 3 kids online at the same time. And I just got back from India, and the teachers in Mumbai were saying that some of the kids would even have a certain amount of bandwidth for a week or a month at a time. And so by the time it got to the end of the week, they could no longer join classes because they didn't have enough time left on the stick. So I think for some people, like, the online experience was really positive and they're ready to jump in, and those schools are ready to continue to keep going. But I think there are also some that are hesitant, depending on how their parents responded and what was going on in those homes, and also, you know, how well-resourced the school was.
It's interesting how you bring up that anecdote of the kids having a certain amount of bandwidth. I think something that, you know, if you think of globally, international schools are very privileged, but there were many schools in countries and districts that really struggled and had those infrastructure issues and maybe even systems issues that were so challenging. And it's nice to have both of Michael and your perspective on this. Den.
Yeah, so great points, everyone. Got a question now. This is a great one from John about overcoming hesitancy in online learning. Question to you all: what have you observed in your work with schools and educators, and the more unexpected hesitancies and challenges faced by schools in adopting online learning, and strategies to overcome these barriers?
I can jump in. You know, I don't know if there's unexpected barriers, but I do think there's kind of a baseline sort of technical proficiency and technical motivation on the part of teachers. In other words, like, how good are their core competencies with using technology for the purposes of their job to begin with, right? Like, is a steep learning curve to adopt it, and that can be challenging. But also, what is their interest and motivation in taking on that challenge? And I think the hesitancy I've seen from teachers, you know, a lot of my current work is around AI, and I'm seeing similar hesitancy now among teachers. Is it kind of boils down to, you know, a core belief system around what is learning, what is education for, what's the best way to connect with students, what do you actually believe to be true about education and the value of education, combined with how comfortable and how confident do you feel actually opening a computer and making something using technology. And if those two things aren't in place, and or the teacher doesn't feel strongly supported by their school in order to, you know, work on one of those two things, I think that can be really challenging when it comes to adoption at the individual educator level.
I think that's interesting that you bring that up, Eric, because I think that's often the same case with AI, is that, teachers sometimes feel there's a disconnect, and the last thing they want to do is be in front of kids and feel disconnected from the skill set that maybe they have to engage with, or the tools that they have to engage with. And I think that's a really important point you bring up. Kathleen?
Also, like most of our international schools have some sort of exam model that we're working towards at the end. So I think sometimes resistance to online learning comes because we have to get the kids ready for the IB. We have to get ready for the AP. We have to do IGCSEs. And so when we pull kids out of that, like where does that fit in that trajectory towards IB diploma or towards APs? So I think sometimes schools can be hesitant in pulling kids out of seats to go have a more personalized experience. Not that we don't want personalized learning, and I think all of our schools are working towards that, but there's always that little bit of a tension, I think, with our exam years.
Yeah, I think that's a really good point, is how much the exams dominate sometimes the outcome of the purpose of what we're doing. Michael?
Mhm.
Yeah, I would add, I think the expectations from schools is also part of this, right? Not necessarily acknowledging what's possible in different learning environments. And we saw that during COVID, right? It was the desire to replicate in online classrooms what happens on campus. And that didn't work well, right? That wasn't healthy for students when schools did that. I mean, I know schools that checked in on faculty to make sure they were teaching their class online at the time they were supposed to, right? When an online space really affords flexibility and time and how you're engaging students, but it also requires rethinking and reimagining a lot of the learning experience. It requires teachers to think differently about their role, right? It requires letting something go. It requires like thinking differently, as Kathleen was saying, about like the way that we want to assess. And so I think that was definitely and continues to be a hurdle, in that the expectations, I think, very often are that online should mirror on campus, when in fact it's an opportunity to do things differently. But that gets into like this value proposition that exists, right? Where this has been hurting my feelings for 12 and a half years, right? That online in some way is less than a traditional learning experience, when in fact it can be more than that. But again, not with the goal of replacing. I want to be clear, like nobody's advocating for that, but it can enhance student agency. It can enhance the creativity. It can enhance the teacher's role in so many creative ways. But again, I think the expectations of what's possible are contribute to some of that hesitancy.
Michael, building on that idea of hesitancy, and you talk about the value-added proposition, do you think did schools understand the value-added proposition, or were they too in the COVID cloud, that they really never made that connection, that there is a value-added proposition of, as you described, personalized learning, student agency? I don't know if Eric or Kathleen or even Michael, if you could address that a bit.
I can jump in on that one. I think because COVID happened so fast and was so disruptive, there wasn't a lot of time or, emotional or mental bandwidth for schools to really sort of take a strategic approach to it, right? And I think that's totally understandable. I think all the sort of like after effects in terms of hesitancy as a result of kind of the trauma of how fast and disruptive COVID was, all understandable. I wonder, this goes back to what Michael was saying around value proposition. I do wonder how well schools have looked back and reflected on their pandemic experience. There was such a rapid move to kind of get back to school, to get back to quote unquote normal coming out of the pandemic, that something I'm seeing, and again, in the context of AI, just a continuing sort of, I wish schools had done a little more processing of what they learned from their pandemic experience, what the positive and negative impacts were on both their institution and the people who occupy them, and what they want to carry forward from that experience, and getting a little more sort of precise about exactly what we mean by online learning and what elements of online learning are most productive or important for our schools, mission and strategy. So I kind of understand the not taking a strategic approach when COVID happened. I do wish there was sort of a little bit more open reflection now that we are a few years out from the pandemic.
It's interesting. Like, I really agree with what you said, Eric, because I'm looking at in what I do. I work with a lot of different schools, and it amazes me how many schools have kind of, forgotten about online learning. We'll talk about online learning, and like, what's your strategy? Have you got a plan to go to hybrid, to online? Are you doing practice days? Are you doing things? And a lot of schools have just kind of buried their head in the sand. I think sometimes it kind of takes a crisis. It's like, you got on a weekend and you go to a party and you get really drunk. And then the next day you got a hangover and like, okay, I'm not ever going to drink again. And you're really healthy the next few days. And then, the other weekend comes along. It's like, you know what, it'd be great. I'm going to go out for a beer tonight. It's like, unless the further removed you are from the sort of the incident, the more you forget about it. So I'm surprised how many schools are I think every school is doing something, and there's a spectrum. Some schools are doing a huge amount. Some schools are really, not the crisis has passed. They kind of hope it's not going to happen again. And so online learning has been pushed aside a little bit. And I think that's a mistake.
Totally agree. Oh, sorry, John.
No, go ahead, Michael, please.
I don't know anything that you're talking about the hangover and drinking the next day.
It's a hypothetical story.
That. But at the beginning of COVID, we talked, Eric and I talked all the time about, like, is this a slingshot moment for schools, right? Is this going to be a moment that schools will embrace rethinking systems and rethinking learning design and things like that? And everybody knows that's not what happened. I'm hearing there were a few schools that identified, right? There's one school I know of that they call them COVID keepers. They literally name those things that they did differently that they want to continue to move forward. I love that. But I also feel like in the introduction of AI is such a fascinating time, right? And I do wonder if we're at this kind of confluence of those two things, right? That we have enough distance from what happened during COVID, plus the advent of AI, if this is going to be kind of a spark for schools to really dig in and think differently. And that's the optimist in me. I kind of like want and hope that happens. It feels like the environment is ripe for it, and that all of the components and ingredients have been added now, right? Like, I don't know, what do we just have to stir it and wait? But it feels exciting.
Kathleen.
Well, we have done a lot of reflecting, I think, on what went well, what went wrong, what we want to carry forward. But I think that, but there is a little bit of a lag, and we're not so worried about it anymore. And, but I think we are still trying to think of ways that we can use what we learned to move our students forward and move our kids forward. And part of that is, I think, this big push for transparency. And I remember Michael saying in an AIE talk when we were all online, it was right in the beginning, and he was like, parents are in the classroom like never before, that they're sitting next to their kid watching what's going on. They're helping their kid navigate the LMS to find the information. And I think parents don't really want to let go of that either. And I don't think the parents are like combing through everything their kids are doing all the time, but they want to be that Periscope parent that comes in once in a while and like, oh, what's my kid working on right now? Especially with middle school learners who come home and be like, I don't know what I did today. At least the parent can do the preemptive strike and see what was going on in the classroom and then have those conversations. But I think parents are asking for that transparency. They want to know where their money's going and what their kids are learning. And they also know that their kids sometimes aren't good at metacognition and explaining what it is that they're learning. So I think that whole push to be so transparent, so online, is that we've kept it that way. We're trying to display our content online. So even though the magic's still happening in the classroom face to face, there's still a record of what we did each day. Parents can go and see the feedback that I've given to kids, probably face to face as well as written, as well as, that's what other teachers are doing. So I think that sometimes it's the little things, maybe not a huge systems change where we have kids, messing around with time and space, but we're like more transparent, I think, than ever before.
And I think that's interesting because that transparency gives agency to the parents and to the kids and to the teachers. It's kind of everybody's got the open book, and there's no hidden agendas, and everybody comes in with their perspectives, as you say. Michael, you talk about the slingshot, and I like that term because I remember being in many meetings during COVID, and everybody was like, we're going to reinvent school. This is an invitation to start school. Dan and I talked to people. We talked to school heads, and there was all this eagerness. It was like, they will never be the same. You know, COVID, we've never had COVID, kind of the drum roll. Nobody's ever experienced this. We are new. But I'm sorry, everybody's doing the same thing. And I'm over exaggerating and generalizing, but there are definitely little things that changed. And now you talk about AI maybe being that extra ingredient, that Tabasco sauce that's suddenly been put in the salad dressing. And I'm just curious, is this really going to happen? I'm going to ask Eric to start off, and then we can talk, because I am a little cynical about all the change that was going to happen after COVID. And don't get me wrong, there are many positive changes that happened, but I don't think as revolutionary as people were saying we could reinvent school. Eric?
I can't predict the future, so I don't know for sure what the long-term AI impact, but I do think I share, maybe it's not cynicism, I share some of your wariness about sort of over-promising on AI, because I think AI is very powerful and it's a new technology, but we have been here before with technological innovation, even before COVID. Think about the advent of the internet and how the internet was supposed to transform schools, right? And I go back to this idea of like, how are we reflecting? Like when we look back on the internet, when you look back on COVID, what did we do well with those disruptions? What did we not do well? What do we not anticipate from those disruptions? And how can we adjust our behavior? And to the point around sort of, we were all talking this big game during COVID about how it was a slingshot moment for schools. I just want to name, and again, I'll overgeneralize here. I want to name something I observed during COVID and something I'm observing now with AI, which is a gap between leadership and classroom educators around how we perceive these technological innovations. So during COVID, for example, I was in a lot of those meetings too, and the people in the room were all administrators, right? There were folks who were not necessarily on the ground with students. And when I would meet with teachers, which I also did a lot during COVID, they were dealing with a whole other set of problems and priorities. And there was a gap between how well administrators and teachers were communicating across the sort of like vision slingshot brainstormy space and the sort of I'm just trying to get through the day space. And I think there's real work to be done at schools around how we think about bridging the gap between theory and practice, bridging the gap between vision and sort of application of vision, and how we provide each other support in both directions to make sure that we're really understanding each other's experience. Because my big takeaway from COVID, and one of the things that really drives my work now, is thinking about that. How do we better understand the experiences of all the humans in schools and how they're different, and try to make collective decisions from there?
I think it's such an important observation that you brought up, is this idea that, you know, you have administrators kind of visioning slingshot, as we use Michael's term, and then teachers really in the trenches with the kid that's sick, the mother that's not happy, or whatever. And I think often that creative tension, Dan, I used the word, sorry.
It's your favorite. I love those that phrase. It's a phrase more than a word, isn't it?
Yeah. Anyway, that creative tension between the two. Do you think that there's an awareness? I mean, you observed that, and you were in both the kind of trenches with the teachers and in those administrative visioning meetings. Do you think, Kathleen and Michael, there's more awareness of that? Or is it people like Eric and yourselves that have to say, yo, guys, hold on here. You need to check this because we've got this gap going. I don't know, Michael and Kathleen, your thoughts?
Yeah, I think it does need to be addressed. I think that's really true. That sometimes they don't, although they may have been teachers before they became administrators, and even though they may be leading the charge and being super supportive of the innovation that's happening in the classrooms, both with online learning and with AI, there's still that like, but I'm in the classroom every day dealing with, is this my kid's work or not? And I don't think it is. And what do I do now? Or, I'm struggling to keep up with planning an online lesson, all of that. So I think that is true. I think communication is like the most important part right now that we're dealing with. Communication and wellness, right? I think that whole focus on how are we doing and how are we feeling about this? And am I feeling heard? Do you see my struggle? Do you see the cool things that I'm doing? So I think, yeah, it's like, how do we create a space where that gap can be reduced?
And I agree with that. I think too, and in that same vein of communication, I think we've been seeing this trend develop and grow over a few years, which is schools being more deliberate about their expectations for faculty. And I think that goes again to the communications piece, where in order to close the gap, right, that faculty aren't going to magically acquire the skills and mindsets that school leaders hope they will to do the things that they're trying to move the school in the direction of achieving, but that they are actually providing time and space, and the ability to practice and learn in-house, right? Like, we're moving, right? We are thinking about what we want to do with AI, and we are going to provide you with the experiences to acquire those skills, and we're going to practice them together. That feels different than what I often call it, like kind of the laissez-faire approach to professional development that's existed for a really long time in schools, that I think is waning, and we're moving more into, like, again, deliberate, focused, driven teacher support, which is exciting. I love that.
Do you think because of what you're bringing up, the teacher support, is, AI just a very different beast because it's so powerful and we don't actually know? There's the whole black box idea, and suddenly teachers have these tools independent of a school system or an administrator, and suddenly there's these very powerful tools that can actually maybe enhance and empower individuals and not the system as such. That now there is greater urgency to have this purposeful, authentic professional development, and everybody being on the same page on what is the approach and how do we engage with that, Michael?
I think that's a good example. I mean, in international schools, I think there's also a trend for schools to elevate the work they're doing with students, to align it to their mission in a way that, in some ways, like, goes beyond IB or other kind of box like curricula. Right? What does it mean to graduate from this school with this diploma? Right? We're in this country, in this city. How can we tie our theory of practice to this location? In some ways, it's not just about the location. So I think that schools, again, are just being more deliberate, whether it's about AI or just mission alignment, right? This is who we are. These are the things that we value. This is what we want a learning experience here to be like. What do teachers need from us to do that? And again, internationally, like that's been a very exciting trend that has been growing over the past few years in great ways.
Kathleen?
Yeah, I think going back to the COVID, I mean, I think because we shifted so much and things were so uncertain and so unclear of what's going to happen next, that it almost made the emergence of AI with ChatGPT last year, it almost made it so much easier to shift and react immediately, instead of like, ooh, we don't want our kids to know this. Ooh, let's block it. We were ready to go after it and shift. And I think part of that too was just one of the ways we tried to close that gap of communication was that everyone did staff development on AI, not just the teachers, the administrators, the people working in the administrative offices, the secretaries, looking at what AI would look like in our own jobs for our own productivity, as well as how we would use that with students and coach students. So I think it was really cool that we were able to come together in that, like, all of us are doing this together. And then I think too, just having a school that, I mean, we're the world of opportunities is what we always say. It's part of our mission. And that this opportunity to play and discover, to make mistakes, and to try to just like keep the lines of communication, especially with kids, open, like having those open conversations. Is this good? What we just created, is this, like, if I create this bot to evaluate American foreign policy in my US history class, and we load it with a rubric, which is the same rubric you would use to judge this foreign policy, let's see how well it does. How can we use this in the future? What are the implications? What are the problems? How accurate is it? And I think just, and I had a kid the other day say, well, Mrs. Ruff, I don't want to out myself. And I said, but this should be a safe place where we can ask those questions, because we're all new. And if you don't ask and you don't talk about it, then you won't know if what you're doing is ethically correct or not. So I think just like having that opportunity to play in a safe space is really important.
I think that safe space is really an important word that you're using. And the idea, again, that transparency, opportunity to play is about being transparent. Eric, you wanted to add?
No, I couldn't agree with Kathleen more. And I think something that she's kind of alluding to is the cultural element of all these things. It's not just a structural or tactical issue. It's not just a pedagogical issue. What is the culture of our school? How are we supporting an environment where people feel psychologically safe and empowered to try new things without fear of sort of punishment or retribution? How do we communicate and establish that kind of culture? And I think from my experience, the schools who came out of the pandemic the healthiest were the schools that had the strongest cultures of trust. And that to me was the single sort of greatest factor in terms of, success coming out of COVID. And I think a lot about, when I think about innovation in schools, I think a lot about Mitch Resnick. He started the Lifelong Kindergarten Lab at MIT. They created Scratch. Yeah. And he talks a lot about, like, their philosophy is really, you need wide walls and no ceiling, right? So how do we provide some wide walls, so some high level constraints or values or guidelines that help teachers and students understand the space or the broad expectations, but they have room within those wide walls to play, to make different kinds of decisions, to be innovative, to create new ideas and new spaces. And I think that gets to what Kathleen was saying around the importance of experimentation and the importance of sort of celebrating and valuing experimentation as part of adopting these innovations. We don't know, especially with AI, we don't know the long-term implications of AI for education right now, but we certainly should be taking a learning stance towards it and figuring out how these tools work and what the implications are.
And the culture piece is so interesting that you bring that up, because I think sometimes we underestimate what a culture can do. And I think in the context of AI, there's, working with a few schools, there's a certain amount of fear, that unknown. And what do you create in the culture, as you were saying, and Kathleen was alluding, actually all of you are saying, is this safe space, this culture of transparency, that communication, and that opportunity to take the time to reflect. I think all those become so important. And it's, if you would think, is that do you think there's a special mindset of a teacher and a leader to engage with that? And what are you seeing in the teachers that have that mindset and educators that have that mindset? What are kind of the dispositions, if you had to, describe them to somebody watching them in action? I don't know, any of you three that might like to share that. Michael?
Yeah, I think one that we've been talking a lot about, especially in the AI conversation, is the mindset of curiosity. And we talk about that with students too. With AI, it is literally demonstrating curiosity through the ability to ask good questions and absorb new information and ask another question, right? What do you want to know and how are you going to learn it? And I think similarly with teachers and leaders, we should be asking questions in our communities about what if, or how could we, or right? Like, what are those curiosity mindset questions that we could lead with to create space, like Eric is saying, for teachers to try new things, right? What if I did it differently, rather than a stance of this is how I do it, right? And I think that's a tension that is going to exist, because there are some ways that we do things that are really good still, right? And they don't need to change. And kids need to know how to take notes during a lecture, but there needs to be this space too for and we should encourage this and extol it, right? Like that curious mindset. I think that's one of the most critical skills that students and adults can show now and moving forward.
Eric?
Yeah, I totally agree with curiosity. I would add vulnerability to that. It is challenging to try new things. I think a lot of sort of identity in schools is built around our sense of our own expertise, our sense of our, mastery of certain content or certain pedagogy. And so to try new things in front of students or front of colleagues is very vulnerable making and very challenging for some teachers. And what I've seen sort of help teachers overcome and embrace that vulnerability is a really clear sense of purpose. So they really understand the value of what they teach. They understand the value of, what they want students to learn. And they are able to kind of apply that purpose to experiments with technology or different kinds of tools, and their clarity of purpose really allows them to clearly communicate to students what they're trying to do, why they're trying to do it, and bring students along with them in this kind of experimentation with the tool.
I like that connection of bringing them along. It's almost like a partnership, in that vulnerability and that curiosity together. Kathleen?
And I think also it's just that future thinking, or thinking beyond yourself. We always want to do what's best for kids, but I think rather than being nostalgic about the past, that it's super important to think about the future, and that the world of work for our students is going to be completely different than the world of work for us. And I think those teachers who think beyond the way life is now or the way life had been for them in the past, they're the ones thinking like, I got to change what I do because this kid needs to be prepared for the future. They need to be able to, write good prompts. They need to be able to work from home and work at school or at their job. It's like the hybrid workplace isn't going away. Hot desking, like all the things that have come up from this. And so I think, it's just having that mentality of, you're teaching kids for something maybe we don't even know yet. And we just got to do the best we can at like preparing them for that world.
It's interesting you bring up the hot desking and the hybrid, because Dan, I think if anybody in this room lives that, you hot desk around the world, you work virtually, most of your team, you don't ever see each other. And I'm just wondering, and you have 2 kids in an international school, are you seeing a disconnect? I mean, I know they're very young, but you go to a lot of schools and nobody's working like you. You work at the airport, you work wherever, you get an internet connection.
Yeah, I think I was an early adopter. I mean, I've been remote for almost 20 years now, and even since that, it was pre-Skype and everything, I was still doing a lot of remote stuff. So I kind of it's really normal to me. I think it's so hard for schools because it's changing so rapidly, and it's really for the majority of people. I mean, there's a few stages, and this is a whole different conversation. But the remote work thing, there's a few distinct stages. I mean, pre-COVID, there was I don't know if you guys know about kind of a digital nomad scene. I've kind of known a lot of people in that, and that was an early remote work situation where people would kind of start a business remotely or persuade their employer they could work in different places, or maybe they wanted to take and also online education, like obviously Michael and you guys are involved in. There's a lot of online programs. I did an online master's program, as well. So I think that, and I think COVID really made it normal. If I take all my friends now, the ones that don't work for schools, the ones that work for for companies, banks, things like that, I think every single one works hybrid. Like Kathleen said, every single one of my friends. Like if I go to London now, it's so hard to meet my friends because I've got to pick a day when everyone's at the office and everyone's there for 3 days a week maximum. So in terms of how do schools teach students for this new world? it's I don't have any answer. I think it's so hard because we'll be in a different situation in 3 years or 5 years. I think the only thing is teaching adaptability, resilience, working online, teaching online. I think schools that have test COVID days, or I've heard different names for it, but days, or even if the children are on the campus and they do some lessons online, which I'm sure Kathleen's doing things like that. I think that's really good in helping students to sort of get used to this online work mentality.
Michael, you wanted to add?
Yeah, I think I love what you're saying, Dan. And I think too, it's not just teaching students how to do these things, it's going to come down to also modeling it.
Yeah.
How are schools creating opportunities for flexible working environments for adults? Again, I know that's different, right? Elementary school, that's the agreement, right? You're going to be in class. Those students aren't working flexibly. As you go into the older grades, that becomes a very real question. And I think for teachers right now too, they are, in the workplace, they're the employees with no flexibility, while all of their friends and peers are going in once or twice a week, but they're home in the afternoon. They're going to their kids' sporting events or after school activities. They're having dinner with the family. And that tacit agreement, I think, that existed for a long time in schools with teachers of, we're not going to pay you a ton, but you're also going to work really, really, really hard, is being stressed significantly.
Yeah.
And so unless schools start modeling this by rethinking expectations, and then also this ties into skilling up their faculty to know how to rethink time, and then for the leaders to say, oh, well, we're going to then rethink the schedule. Then we're going to have, it's not just always going to be about what we're doing with students. We're going to have to do this with adults too.
Yeah.
2 points that you bring up, Michael, is this idea of time and the schedule. And I think schools are prisoners to the schedule. And it's almost like, if you keep redoing a routine, it becomes second nature and it's almost in your DNA. And I know when, if somebody wants to do an event and suddenly we're off schedule, there's all this tension. But when am I going to teach this? When am I going to do that? And there is, and because I think all of you are saying we need to model it, maybe the leaders have to model it. Maybe we need have cohorts that start doing that. Because I think, what Dan and his whole cohort have been doing it's natural and they're extremely successful. There is no issues of trust. And I think so often we say, oh, well, if the teachers go offline, they're not going to really be working. They're going to be watching. We talked about culture and trust. So I think some of those come up. So we're coming to the end of our podcast, and I'd like each one of you. So where are we going? What do you see? AI is now, we talked about AI and we talked about how maybe we now can engage with this differently from our experience with COVID and prior. Where do you think, if I was a school leader today and I needed to kind of think, okay, down the next 18 months, what are some things I need to get in place? Or even an educator thinking, what is going to come down the pipeline from your vantage point, what you're seeing? And I might ask Eric to start.
Yeah, I guess a question I've been posing to school leaders about AI is, what are you going to do when every single one of your students has a high quality personalized tutor in their pocket? And what does that mean for school? Because, right now, all the companies that are putting all this money into AI in terms of education, they're very focused on the personalized tutoring side of it, right? How do we make these AI bots really high quality tutors? But school is so much more than that element of it. School is relationships. Schools is social emotional learning. Schools is, figuring out what your vision for yourself and your future is. And so I really think school leaders should be thinking about, what are the things about school that cannot be replaced by AI, that the Silicon Valley companies are not interested in trying to do with AI? And how do you lean into those strengths in a way that integrates AI in a really meaningful, thoughtful way? I think, this idea that the robots are taking over is kind of a little bit overblown. And I think kind of this idea of hybrid is going to integrate this idea of like human and AI in service of a very human-centered mission or human-centered work. And I think there's a real opportunity for schools to think about leveraging AI to do the things that schools have always done well, even better.
And I like that idea that you're really highlighting the idea of cohabitation. Let's not push it away or let it take over, but let's work together and let's have that collaborative relationship with AI and the way we look at it and the way we leverage it. And I love the fact that you're saying, yeah, imagine all the things that we wouldn't have to do, testing, teaching Pythagoras theory, we don't need to know about the Napoleonic Wars anymore. I mean, I'm just thinking there's just a lot of things that are really interesting. Thank you, Eric, for that. Kathleen?
So are we talking just AI or like where we see schools going?
I think schools going.
Call this the AI podcast at this point, John, because every conversation ends up with AI. It's like a.
But you know what I'm going to say about AI? It's the way Eric posed his question to the leaders was a chatbot in your pocket. That's online learning. You're basically, I think AI is in some ways online learning. It's just a different dynamic. But I think many of the things that we've been talking to have, connect to that. So I don't know if that helps in your response, Kathleen.
Well, I think schools are going to change. I mean, I hope we change our structures. And I think this goes back to what we were talking about before. As we are looking for sustainability of educators, we're going to have to change the way school looks, I think. Because we need more educators, and we know that there aren't that many waiting in the wings to come on, and we have to make that more enticing for people. And I think we also have to use our time better in when kids are at school. And do they always need to be in a classroom every hour? Or could it be that we have 4 days of instruction and 1 day of doing other things? Or do we structure the day in a different way so that they can do those deep dives and can be working collaboratively and can be doing those creative things that AI isn't going to help them with, that those people skills that they have to build? Because I think it's the people skills that kids are struggling with right now, especially the younger ones in the middle school level. They're the ones that missed out on. I don't see it so much in my daughter's year group as I do in the kids who are in elementary school and home. It's just like those little things that it's like hard to quantify of like, these kids are really different. They don't have as much self-control. They don't know how to work with each other yet. They seem younger, but they have the same amount of knowledge as a typical sixth grader would have had prior to COVID. It's just the people skills sometimes that's missing. So I think it's going back to what Eric said too, like what can we be doing to like boost creativity, boost those people skills and collaboration so that then they can use that personalized tutor in their pocket in really amazing, save the world kind of ways.
And that social emotional capacity, I think, is just the piece that maybe is a value added that Eric was alluding to and that you're bringing up through your observations of these sixth graders that have the knowledge, but kind of the interpersonal and collaboration sometimes are just a little challenging. Michael.
Yeah, I mean, definitely the AI, Kathleen. I mean, that's kind of where I was going. But going to what you just said, John, about the social emotional learning, I think that's probably the angle that I think schools need to be really thinking about why they need to do things differently, or just continuing to evolve, right? Like thinking about the wellness of our faculty and the wellness of our students. We've got to start providing more flexibility in what school looks like. And we've got to relinquish some of the, someone earlier used the word nostalgia, the nostalgia of school. We've got to let it go. And it's hard. I get it. It's really hard. We just applied for high school for my daughter, and like being in a school campus and seeing what they're doing there, it is a really strong, like gravitational pull that nostalgia has of what what feels familiar and it feels right and good. But we've got to start thinking about what's right and what's good for the health and well-being of the people in our schools. And in order to do that, I do think like the key in the lock is going to be time, right? Like knowing that we're not designing for 50-minute classes I thumbs up myself. That we're not
This is
designing
a good
for,
point. You should be
thank
thumbing
you,
up
computer,
yourself.
for agreeing with me. That we're not designing for 50-minute classes, or we don't have to be in class, like Kathleen said, 4 or 5 days out of the week, but that we can introduce some flexibility and different ways of engaging. And that is going to, bringing it to the theme of this podcast today, it's going to involve online learning spaces. There's no way around that. You've got to think about how to do things deliberately, how to have a discussion online, how to post videos and give feedback online, how to engage online, how to meet online. Like, we've got to practice that. And schools, unless they start embracing that in some way, they're just going to continue to be stuck.
Yeah, and it's interesting you're talking about the meeting online and discussing online. Actually, a lot of kids are doing it in an edutainment context as consumers. But what are we doing to translate that into kind of professional capacity to use those tools? Because I think sometimes kids misunderstand. I know sometimes when for some teachers are saying with the discussion boards, it felt like a chat. It's like, no, we're not chatting. No emojis. This is about Shakespeare. So I think so. Dan, what are your thinking hearing all this? And also, you have 2 kids that are in school and you work a lot with schools, kind of what you see this next 18 months.
I think, look, this has been as one of the podcasts I've been learning a lot. This is not my area of expertise. I'm really interested to see this. I think the online learning, I mean, I guess a point I'd make is that like, it's not like the opposite. It's an opportunity as opposed to be something to be feared. I mean, if you look, take kids nowadays, the number of kids I've come across who have like started their own online businesses, they're working for NGOs. There's kids that have actually got jobs. This whole scene is mind blowing. The opportunities, and this is only possible because of online work. I mean, an 18-year-old couldn't have got a job in an NGO, but they're doing that. I mean, children are, and the opposite. I think that's what we've got to get across in terms of online learning is, getting students used to that environment is something that can just give them a huge opportunity, in life. And, that's kind of my closing point on it.
Eric?
Yeah, I just wanted to kind of go back to something you said a minute ago, John, which is, in some ways, all this vocabulary does us a disservice, like online, blended, AI, hybrid. These are not separate things. These are all of a piece of the role technology plays in our lives. And so I think we really have to think about all the ways technology is already embedded in our lives and our students' lives, how much we already use online spaces to learn and connect, and how all these innovations are kind of an extension of that and not sort of siloed, separate things that we need to take on as new innovations or new things. We have already been working on these things for years. We've already learned a lot. How can we just kind of move forward and improve upon? Because I do think it's all part of one ecosystem rather than a series of separate innovations that we need to deal with sort of a la carte.
That's such an important point, I think. And I think Dan, I think in the world that Dan and his cohort and colleagues and his organization work in, they don't talk about online or hybrid, right, Dan? You just work. It's just, I'm in a Google Meet, I'm in a Zoom, I'm whatever. So I think, and also Dan, your point about how much kids are doing online, and you see kids that have their own fashion blog. Just go to TikTok and watch what some of these kids are doing. Okay, a lot of people are very critical, but there's some kids doing some really interesting things, and they're leveraging that online capacity. So, Eric, thank you for really highlighting that idea. Let's stop siloing it, and let's just understand it's one big kind of cloud, or whatever you want to call it, one ray of sunshine, or let's call it a ray of sunshine, because cloud doesn't sound good. Anyway, listen, first of all, thank you, each one of you, for your time and your expertise. This has been so rich, and really hearing with all the work that you do in your capacity as Global Online Academy and your own personal work and professional work. This has just been so great to listen to and also interact with. So thank you, Eric. Thank you, Kathleen, and thank you, Michael. And just want to again tell our audience, show notes, go and look at the show notes. Michael, Eric, and Kathleen have been generous, and there's some great links to look at. There's also ways to connect with them, and I'm sure if you're interested, reach out to them. And if you haven't had an opportunity, go and look at Global Online Academy, an outstanding resource and some amazing work. And reach out to our guests because they have so much to bring to these conversations. Dan, we'll see each other at the next podcast.
Great. Thank you, guys. A real pleasure. And I learned a lot. So thank you.
Thank you.
Thanks for having.
Yep.
Thanks.